Methyl-isothiazolinone use and the possible link to marine organism death. By me, Tiffany Blatnick, fall 2022. Methyl-isothiazolinone is used in many commercial products. Namely, it's a preservative that helps prevent any sort of microbial growth. Essentially, it's found in paper products. It's used in industrial processes to sanitize water. It's found in paint, adhesives, coating materials, jet fuel. It's namely found in cosmetics, actually, soaps, makeups, shampoos, conditioners, any sort of topical leave-in, bronzers or self-tanners. It's also found in baby wipes quite commonly, which is really quite concerning. Sunscreens, bug sprays, cleaning products, over-the-counter and prescription medicines as well. Pesticides, pretty much anything that's water-based that needs antimicrobial properties to it, you're probably going to find methyl-isothiazolinone. Stealth names of methyl-isothiazolinone. So it's quite the mouthful to say, and it actually comes under quite a few different registered names, and it's most commonly known as MIT for short. But the important part here is to recognize reading labels. It's something that, takes some practice and some time, but the key part here is that you're not always going to recognize MIT when you're reading a label for any sort of product that you're purchasing. MIT is harmful to humans, namely it's going to cause some direct, oral, dermal, eye irritation, inhalation irritations, and it's really quite corrosive. The interesting thing about MIT is that over time, and actually it's typically a short period of time, humans tend to have a fairly systemic allergic reaction to it, so much so that for folks who work with MIT in a commercial setting are required to wear personal protective equipment. So this is something to absolutely consider when you are taking this as a medication or using it as a baby wipe, or even, using it as shampoo or conditioner. You're not using personal protective equipment in these cases. So MIT could be linked to marine death by way of just its general properties. So it has been noted that it's not extremely toxic to birds, so that's great. But most mammals, humans included, as well as pretty much all freshwater and marine organisms, it does affect them quite severely, actually. So what the interesting part about this, though, is that in the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States back in 1998 did a report on MIT, and essentially what they stated was that, yes, it is toxic to marine life. That is quite apparent, and yes, there are, concerns for humans, of course. But with that said, is that they did not do any studies as far as like quantitative risk assessment is concerned, and so while they know it's harmful, they don't know how harmful it could potentially be once it is in the environment. There are some regulations as far as commercial disposal of MIT is concerned, but there are not any sort of, specific regulations when it's inside somebody's home and it's being used as a cleaning product, or say you're putting it on a sunscreen and then jumping into that lake or ocean, or even those baby wipes that you're using on your children and then throwing away. There's no regulations as far as how it's supposed to be disposed of once it's in the public's hands. Why MIT is fatal to fish. So I was able to find a study on zebrafish embryos, and essentially they were exposed to MIT in the larva stage, or while they were still in their eggs, and the hatchability of these fish had a significant decrease. And for those that did survive, they were much smaller in size, and their life expectancy was also much shorter. The interesting thing to note here is that what they found was happening to these fish, and why they were, not thriving, was because of the fact that their miRNA genes that are involved in thyroid hormone regulation were damaged. And the interesting part about this too is that the fish had a hard time, purging any sort of toxicity from the MIT, and so this was a lifelong thing for them. Hormone regulation is incredibly important to pretty much every function within our body, and essentially, not being able to, sleep when you're supposed to sleep, or eat when you're supposed to eat, or even, the flight or flight response that happens. All of these things are regulated by hormones, as well as reproduction. And so, this is kind of a big deal for these fish. Let's look at how MIT affects humans to better understand how it may affect fish. So when MIT is exposed to human cells, it binds to the plasma membrane and the inner wall of the vacuoles of the cell. And essentially what happens is there's a rupture of the cell membrane as well as the nuclear envelope. And so if the cell does not die, essentially what happens is it renders the cell ineffective. And that goes back to that hormone regulation. So with hormone regulation, like I said, it's extremely important to pretty much every single process that a body needs to go through. And so of course there's going to be problems for animals that are affected by MIT. If you'd like to know more about how this process works, you can see a link here to my toxicochemical fact sheet or my metabolic process fact sheet. One thing that I want to note though while we're here, if you look at the chemical structure of MIT, please note that sulfur bond. That's actually going to be really crucial to MIT as a chemical, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. So continuing on with why MIT is fatal to fish. So MIT is extremely effective in and of itself just on its own. When put in combination with other chemicals, it's even more so effective. The thing about MIT though is that in personal care and cosmetic products, 15 parts per million is the maximum for regulation. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. So with that 15 parts per million, that's actually a very small amount. And that small amount is extremely effective in microbial properties as well as in just affecting cells in general. With that said, MIT is also extremely stable. That sulfur bond that we were talking about, this is not a chemical that easily degrades in water. And some specific things have to take place in order for that to happen anyway. The other part about this is that it is water soluble. And so it's, once it's entered the waterway or entered the environment, it's really hard to get it out of that water or that environment. How MIT might have come into contact with the fish. Well, I've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'll explain a little bit more. So those cosmetic problems or products that you're using in your home and on your body and those cleaning products as well, these things are essentially just being washed off and down the drain into wastewater. There's no regulations on how you're supposed to do that, and this is being done in mass quantities in pretty much every household around the globe. Pesticides that are being sprayed directly onto plants, those enter the environment immediately, and there is no buffer room between when it's being used and when it enters the environment. Products containing MIT that are being, quote unquote, properly disposed of, this just isn't necessarily happening because other than on a commercial basis, there is no regulation for proper disposal. And we all know that wastewater from facilities producing or using any specific type of chemical, these facilities don't always do what they're supposed to do, and there are chemical leaks that happen. The other part about that, though, too, is that study or that report done from the Environmental Protection Agency, that's back from 1998. Are these, those regulations even being followed now? They're extremely outdated. So going back to that sulfur bond in the MIT chemical structure, one of the things that we need to consider here is that once it has come into contact with the environment, once it's in the water, there's only one of two compounds that make up MIT that are susceptible to degradation in water. And this is only under very specific circumstances. So this means that it has the ability to persist in our natural environment, and we have not assess those risks yet. We really don't know how bad this could affect our planet. So in summary, essentially MIT's not really going away. That sulfur bond that I talked about, the only way that this is going to break off of that MIT chemical and degrade the chemical as a whole is if ozonation happens. And can this happen in a natural setting? Absolutely. Essentially what happens with ozonation and chemicals that are in water is that UV rays from the sun come down and they start breaking things up. In MIT's case, that sulfur bond comes off. But the thing about it, though, that we have to understand is that MIT, as far as its molecular weight is concerned, it's much heavier than open water. So what's going to happen is that it enters that waterway and it might be at the surface for a little while, but it's going to slowly float down. And as it goes down, it's going to, affect everything that it comes into contact with. And those UV rays only go, so far as where mid is going. So essentially, it's not easily degraded, and it has leaked into our waterways in mass quantities, given the range of products that it's used in. I do truly believe that the fish are likely being affected by this chemical, and we did talk about how if it's used in conjunction with other chemicals, it's extremely effective. And so there's a whole other host of chemicals that are leaking into our environments currently. Given there's been no new publications on MIT since 1998 by the EPA, I think it should be considered as a likely cause and should be further investigated. Thank you so much for your time.